Karl Bennett's life wasn't exactly easy or happy. The man worked at one of Ohio's metallurgical plants for a long time. And if it weren't for his deteriorating health, he probably wouldn't have agreed to move to another state. The decision to take such an important step was prompted by Mr. Bennett's conversation with his physician, who, having studied the results of Mr. Bennett's tests, advised the elderly man to seriously think about his health. "Mr. Bennett, I don't want to give you any specific numbers, but your lung x-rays have me concerned. You've dedicated many years to working for the industry, and now you are paying for it with your health. So I suggest, Mr. Bennett, that you find a house in New Hampshire or Vermont and stay out in the fresh air as much as possible," the doctor said to Mr. Bennett, looking attentively at the elderly patient sitting in front of him. It was definitely hard for Mr. Bennett, who spent most of his life in one place, to take this desperate step and go into the unknown at his age. But on the other hand, the old man knew in his heart that the doctor was telling the truth, and that any delays in his matter were death-like. Mr. Bennett had no children, and his beloved wife passed away 3 years earlier, so there was nothing keeping him in the city. It took him about 3 weeks to prepare for the move, during which the man sold his house and found a new home in northern Maine. Despite the fact that his move fell on a snowy winter day, Mr. Bennett didn't lose heart, making his way through the snowdrifts and enjoying the beauty of his forest land. The elderly man quickly solved the issue of work by getting a job as a janitor at the local school. During the winter, Mr. Bennett's duties only included cleaning the snow and sprinkling salt on the slippery paths. The whole process usually took the elderly man about 3 hours, after which he had the rest of the day free. Mr. Bennett's house was near the forest, which made it look like the home of the dwarves from a fairy tale. Since the old man had a lot of free time now, he developed an interest in winter fishing, which he had dreamed of doing for many years. It's worth saying that the numerous reservoirs of the state gave Mr. Bennett the perfect opportunity to take on this hobby. One evening, as the old man was returning from his fishing trip, he decided to take a shortcut and drove his snowmobile directly through the forest. Since the catch was good, Mr. Bennett looked forward to baking the fish in the oven and making a delicious dinner out of it. The old man's powerful snowmobile confidently broke through the snowdrifts that blocked his path. It was getting darker by the minute. Mr. Bennett turned on the headlights and barely had time to turn the wheel so as to avoid hitting the animal that was sitting on the trail, blinded by the bright lights. The old man turned off the engine and got off the snowmobile. Then Mr. Bennett cautiously approached the animal, who seemed to have been frozen in place by both fear and cold, and yelped in surprise. "Wow, it's a little wolf. How did you end up here, kid?" In response to the old man's words, the little gray animal barked softly and looked closely at the trunk of the snowmobile, which is where Mr. Bennett's catch was stored. Seeing where the wolf cub was looking, the old man understood everything without words. "Well, you're too little to be eating fish, but here, that's something that'll be just right for you," said Mr. Bennett, and treated the little animal to a little dog biscuit. The old man always had a couple of them on him to treat the dogs living by the schoolyard. Rumbling and munching, the wolf cub quickly finished off the treat and looked impatiently at Mr. Bennett with its small, button-like eyes. "You probably haven't eaten in a long time. What happened to you? And where is your mother?" the old man whispered, realizing that the cub most likely got lost in the blizzard that was raging almost 3 days ago. Mr. Bennett thought for a moment and said, "You know what? Why don't you come with me? You won't be able to survive alone in the forest. So you'll stay with me for a while. I live alone, no family, no kids." As if to show his agreement, the gray cub sneezed and looked closely at the old man. And Mr. Bennett was already unbuttoning the collar of his down jacket, preparing a warm place for the little wolf. On their way home, the little cub warmed up and quickly fell asleep, which made the sentimental old man shed a tear. Mr. Bennett understood that he was unlikely to be able to tame the little predator, and that one day he would soon have to go back to the forest. But on the other hand, the old man knew that he wouldn't be able to forgive himself if he left the cub to die of hunger and cold in the forest. Thus, as they got home, Mr. Bennett prepared a treat for the little wolf, which was milk with pieces of bread. Smelling the unfamiliar smell of a human house, the cub got scared and backed away to the exit. "Don't be afraid, you poor thing. I won't harm you." The old man laughed and put a bowl with the fragrant delicacy in front of the forest animal. Having eaten the treat, the wolf cub became noticeably kinder and lay down on the old coat, kindly laid out for him by Mr. Bennett. Looking with affection at the sleeping cub, the old man felt a pleasant feeling arise in his soul, something he's never felt before. Mr. Bennett decided to name the gray wolf in honor of the special color of his fur. Thanks to the good nutrition and care, the cub quickly got stronger and was soon galloping around the house with might and main, turning everything upside down. Mr. Bennett was amazed at how much Gray looked like an ordinary yard puppy. If it wasn't for the gray color of his fur, which pointed to the fact who he really was, the wolf cub could easily be mistaken for a domestic pet. Gray stayed at Mr. Bennett's house for about 2 weeks and then began to insist on going outside. "So what, Gray? Did you already hear the call of the wild? Go, but be careful, and don't forget your old man," Mr. Bennett said with a smile and opened the door. Deep down, Mr. Bennett still hoped that Gray would return, and he actually did. The wolf cub came back the next morning, and having examined the empty bowl, looked inquiringly at the old man. "Now hold on, kid, I'll be quick," Mr. Bennett said excitingly, fussing around the kitchen. Since then, Gray had come to visit the old man almost every day. Sometimes he didn't come alone, but with his forest brothers, whose footprints Mr. Bennett often saw near his home. Of course, they never came close to the old man and looked with apprehension at Gray's friendship with the human. Time passed, and Gray grew stronger and turned into a real forest predator. Returning home from work, Mr. Bennett often saw a wolf standing at the edge of the forest, which seemed to come out of the thickets specially to greet him. The old man always greeted his old friend by waving at him, but one evening, Gray was behaving rather unusually, which surprised Mr. Bennett very much. Instead of going into the old man's house, the young wolf threw his head back into the sky and howled. And soon, all of Gray's forest friends joined in. "What's with them? I've never seen anything like this," thought Mr. Bennett anxiously, and left the door open for the night, hoping that Gray would come to visit him like he used to do. The old man spent the whole evening waiting for Gray, but he never came. But as soon as Mr. Bennett decided to make himself some tea, the door swung open loudly, and 3 men came inside the house, wearing uniforms vaguely reminiscent of the ones worn by builders or factory workers. Caught by surprise, the old man looked at the uninvited guests and asked, "Who are you, and why did you come to my house so late at night?" Instead of a response, Mr. Bennett got a jab in the chest, which instantly knocked him over. "We need food and clothes. Don't be a fool and do what we tell you, and we won't harm you. But if you don't, you'll be the one to blame," answered the unshaven thug who was the leader of this gang and fugitive criminals. Mr. Bennett figured it out from the special prison patches on their jackets. Despite his fragile physique, the old man got up and pounced on the intruders. A knife flashed in the leader's hand, but at that moment, someone's flexible gray body burst in the door, which immediately had all the criminals very confused. It was Gray, who jumped at the leader and bit into his hand, thus saving Mr. Bennett's life. Although the wolf wasn't an adult yet, he was already very strong. The angry animal kept attacking the fugitives over and over again. Unfortunately, fighting 3 people alone was too much, even for a wolf. Jumping at the slightest opportunity, the leader of the gang grabbed his knife from the floor and stabbed Gray twice. The wolf let out a muffled groan and fell to the floor. Quickly losing strength from the blood loss, Gray tried to bite the criminal's leg one last time, but he was already too weak. A spasm slowly passed through the wolf's body, and a white veil clouded his eyes. Mr. Bennett knelt beside the dying wolf and began to cry softly. The old man didn't care about himself anymore. All he wanted was for Gray to survive. But despite all of Mr. Bennett's efforts, Gray died in his arms. After all the commotion, the fugitive criminals decided to flee, but as soon as they left the old man's yard, They were immediately surrounded by an angry pack of wolves, all of whom were eager to avenge Gray's death. However, the fugitives were saved from certain death by the arrival of the search group, which has been tracking them down for 3 days. Barely managing to chase off the wolves, the police officer handcuffed the fugitives and sent them back to the state county jail. But for the grief-stricken Mr. Bennett, it wasn't much of a consolation, because he lost his loyal friend that night. The old man buried Gray at the edge of the forest, at the dividing line between human land and wildlife. Whenever he hears a long wolf howl in the middle of the night, Mr. Bennett thinks that this is Gray, singing about how he misses his forest brothers and his faithful friend who lives in a house by the forest.